Hello, everyone. It's really great to see everyone here. Some of you I've met before, and a lot of new faces. And it's really wonderful to be back here at this incredible institution devoted to really understanding and curing developmental disabilities. I'll be talking today about some of the cognitive and learning difficulties that we see in children, adolescents, and young adults with 22q deletion syndrome. And I'd like to thank my colleagues at Children's Hospital, Dr. Beverly Emanuel and Elaine Zakai and Donna McDonald-McGinn, who so graciously showed up in my office in 1992 and sat down and refused to leave until I agreed to test the first 10 kids with 22q deletion so they could put in a grant. They got that grant, which ran for 5 years, then another grant that ran for another 5 years. So that has really led to a lot of our understanding of cognitive difficulties in kids with the deletion. What I'd like to talk about this morning are something called nonverbal learning disabilities. All of our kids with 22q deletion syndrome, of course, have significant speech and language problems, a lot of delayed speech, and yet once those early language problems begin to clear up, something that we find is that children are still left with a number of very marked visual, spatial, and mathematical difficulties. So I'll be talking about some of that, some of where we think that's happening in the brain, although that's really Dr. Simon's purview, Tony Simon. And more importantly, I think the reason you're here is to talk about some interventions. What are we going to do when we find this stuff? These are lateral views, side views of children's brains at different stages of development. And what I'd like to point out is that as children age, you get this gradual emergence of gyri and sulci. You get much more brain material that is emerging as brains get older. Now with the development of MRI scans, we don't have to take brains out of children's heads in order to see how these changes occur over time. And what I'd like to point out is that at 6 months of age, you've really got a brain that is starting to look very different. And at 15 years of age, we have brains that really approach much more what an adult brain looks like in terms of gyri and sulci. White matter pathways are what allow different regions of the brain to talk to one another. And this is a timeline in years, ages 5 to 20 years of age. And white matter pathways start developing at the back of the brain and move toward the front of the brain. And as these white matter pathways develop over many years, you get greater development of what are called executive functions, the highest level of thinking skills, planning, organization, emotional control. So this is a process that takes a great deal of time. And it's a very subtle and slow-moving process. So what happens when things go slightly wrong with this highly complex process in the brain? You start to get these psychiatric and behavioral and educational difficulties that Brenda was just talking about, learning disabilities, nonverbal learning disabilities, attention deficit disorder, autism, Asperger's syndrome, etc. And if things go really wildly wrong with this complex process, it can really get much worse. Now, we've known for a long time, since Dr. Elias's work at the turn of the millennia, that in general, the brains of children with 22q deletion syndrome are about 11% smaller in gray and white matter. And it's not that the entire brain is smaller. There are certain areas that tend to be smaller, particularly the left parietal lobe. And what do we do in our left parietal lobe? Lots of visual spatial stuff and a lot that's related to mathematical abilities. And right cerebellum is also smaller. What is that responsible for? Higher level language skills, and also there are a lot of connections we now know between the cerebellum and the frontal lobes. So it's probably also related to the executive dysfunction that a lot of kids with the deletion seem to show. I always like to sort of put my talk in a big picture perspective. When we think about learning disabilities or learning problems in the United States, according to the Department of Education, 20% of children will have some kind of learning disability or learning disorder, something that affects their ability to learn in a regular classroom setting. 20%, that's really huge. 1 in 5 kids. Breaking that down a little bit more, what are these things that prevent our children from learning? Well, about 10 to 12% of children in the United States are not reading at grade level. They're reading 1.5 to 2 grade levels below their actual grade. 5 to 6% of school-age children meet conservative research criteria for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. About 10% have a specific language impairment. And then this little group in here that I'm interested in are kids with nonverbal learning disorders. Now, you'll also see that this number is bigger than 20%, and that's because there's a high degree of overlap. If you have attention deficit disorder, then there's about a 35% chance that you won't be reading at grade level or that you'll have a writing disability or a mathematical disability. If you have a language impairment, then your odds of having a reading disability are quite high. So if you have one disorder, it's highly likely that you'll have another concurrent disorder as well that will affect your ability to learn. When children come to my office for a neuropsychological evaluation, I try to do a very comprehensive assessment of their individual strengths and weaknesses. What I have highlighted here in lighter color is measures of IQ, academic achievement, and then mood and behavior, parent rating scales, teacher rating scales, self-rating scales for older children. This is what is contained within a standard school-based psychoeducational evaluation. There's nothing wrong with psychoeducational evaluations. They've been refined over many decades, but they're meant to be short, efficient evaluations to find out if a child is learning at grade level. And then, if not, to slot them into available categories within a school district. Well, I think that that is antithetical to what is called the individualized education program, because what you're really trying to do is make the child fit into a pre-existing category. So when children come to our offices, they get that psychoeducational evaluation because schools need to see it and because it provides a lot of important information. But then I look much more closely at the individual cognitive abilities of the child, including abstract reasoning and verbal and nonverbal modalities, attention and concentration skills, executive functions, and especially working memory skills. What is working memory? Working memory is like RAM in a computer. Information comes in, and then what do you do with it until your brain decides where it's going to go? So before information goes into long-term memory, it's moving around in working memory. It's your ability to hold and manipulate information in your head. I look at long-term memory skills in verbal and nonverbal modalities, expressive and receptive language, visual motor integration skills, which have a lot to do with the later development of writing skills, and then lots of measures looking at fine motor speed and dexterity and sensory perceptual abilities. So everything that a child needs to be successful in a classroom setting. A question that I get a lot is, when is an appropriate time to test a child? And it's not that children should be tested at all of these times, but something to think about are key transition points. A preschooler who's going into kindergarten really should be evaluated because it's the first time they're going to be preparing for early academic work, letter recognition, number recognition. From there, they'll move on to first and second grade. Before third grade, there's a big shift that happens in third grade. Teachers, my wife is a first grade school teacher, and teachers often talk about third grade being the time when children stop learning to read and start reading to learn. What that means is that it's the beginning of real independence in learning abilities is expected. And kids are going to be drawing more from text and having to understand more of what they're reading. Now, before middle school, in elementary school, a teacher has a class, and I know my wife considers herself the shepherd of her flock of 22 students. Well, that all changes when you go to middle school. Suddenly you've got 3 or 4 teachers who are more subject area teachers, and you'll have increased transitions. Kids have to move around to classes more. And then transitioning to high school, this is where things can really go to hell. You have... you not only have the emergence of normal adolescence, and my own daughter is going to turn 15 on Monday, God help me, but Now you have 7 teachers, and you can have, she can have a week, for example, where she has no homework. And then the following week, she's got 200 pages a night. You've got subject area teachers who aren't communicating with one another, and the children have multiple competing demands, so the needs for multitasking and cognitive flexibility really go up. And then finally, as Donna mentioned, we do have many kids with the deletion who are in college or going to college. And if students are going to get accommodations at the college level, you have to prove it. You have to provide data for any accommodation that you're asking for. You want extended time? Well, then you have to provide proof that the student cannot complete their work within the usual time guidelines. You need a writer, a note taker for that student. Well, then you have to prove that they have a writing disability, et cetera. There's sort of a master list of about 17 college level accommodations that students can get, but you need to prove each one. You want extended time on the SATs? You got to prove it. I showed you the tests that are involved in a neuropsychological evaluation. It's really a huge battery of tests on average for a child who's about 10 years old and up. It's about 6 hours of testing that we try to do over multiple sessions, but since many kids come to us from all over the country, we can often do it in a single day with a lot of short breaks and a lunch break. Neuropsychological testing is based on research that was very popular and started in the 60s and 70s, and that by now you in the audience are probably pretty aware of, that the left side of your brain, for most people, is specialized for language functions like speech and reading and writing and verbal memory, and the right side of your brain is really more visual spatial and responsible for visual imagery and perception and judgment and face recognition. So this is all well known. So when I'm evaluating somebody, here's an example of one task. How do you read a book? So if a child is reading, what happens? You look at these, this is the back of the brain, so here's your visual cortex. You're looking at these squiggles on a page, and your brain has to recognize them, so you do it there. And now you have to convert those squiggles into sounds. So you do it here in the angular gyrus. So you see ba, B-A, on the page, and you convert it to the sound ba in your head. You do it there. Then you have to move that information to an area called Wernicke's area, where you comprehend language. So if it's the word barn, you comprehend it here. Then if you're going to say it, you need to move that information along this big fiber tract here up to Broca's area where you can say barn. So reading can break down at any one of these levels. So when I'm doing an assessment of reading skills, I'm looking at all of these different steps. Is the child understanding phonemes? Can they pronounce them? Do they understand what they're reading? And we do this across all of the cognitive domains, including memory, expressive language skills, etc. I mentioned that reading disorders affect about 10 to 12% of children in the United States, and this is based on good population data. So work that was done, for example, in Colorado, where they looked at entire huge geographic areas to look at how many kids were failing to read at grade level, and it's 10 to 12%. Nonverbal learning disabilities we think affect about 1% of children in the general population. It's a little hard to know because it's based on clinic-based studies. So you take a big clinic where maybe they see 1,000 kids a year, and you say, how many of those kids came in with a nonverbal learning disability? Well, what is a nonverbal learning disability? It was first described in the 70s, but really Byron Rourke did the most work on nonverbal learning disabilities in the early 90s. And the hallmarks of a nonverbal learning disability are sort of the opposite of a reading disability. On IQ testing, your verbal intellectual ability, so those IQ subtests that really require good language skills are much stronger than your nonverbal IQ scores. So nonverbal IQ scores are visual spatial skills like putting together block designs, looking at pictures and telling us what's missing. So there has to be at least a 10-point difference with stronger verbal intellectual scores. Reading skills have to be much stronger than math skills, and kids with nonverbal learning disorders tend to have a lot of difficulty with fine motor skills. We like to think about kids with nonverbal learning disabilities as having assets and deficits, strengths and weaknesses. So an asset of nonverbal learning disorder, verbal IQ scores, phonics scores, sight word and word reading skills Kids with nonverbal learning disorders read very well, and they often read early. They have good immediate auditory attention, and they struggle with visual perceptual, visual motor integration skills, math skills, which has a lot to do with executive function and visual perception, complex memory, where there's a lot of information to hold in mind, and fine and gross motor skills. Just a note about math skills. I know Tony will be talking about this much more. Math is really hard. You need to be able to process a lot of visual information online as it's coming in. You need to be able to interpret symbols rapidly and mentally manipulate numbers in your head and use logical reasoning skills. So it's not surprising that many of us, myself included, aren't so great in math. Nonverbal learning disabilities are typically detected much later than reading disabilities, and the reason for that is children have strong verbal learning skills, and there's a lot of focus on that early in education. They tend to have strong rote learning skills. So if you simply break things down and repeat them, they learn them very well. Again, I mentioned they read early. They have very good phonemic awareness. They've cracked the phonetic code. Nonverbal learning disorders have been reported to be much more common among kids who have developmental disorders, and here are three common genetic disorders where nonverbal learning disorders have been reported many times. Neurofibromatosis, Turner's syndrome, which in females, girls with Turner's syndrome have really marked visual spatial problems, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, especially the inattentive type. Also, children with acquired brain disorders like traumatic brain injury will often show the syndrome of nonverbal learning disability. Lots of emotional and behavioral problems have also been associated with nonverbal learning disorders, including high rates of attention deficit disorder, poor social skills, and poor adaptability to change. So kids with NLD tend to be somewhat cognitively rigid. Internalizing disorders like depression and anxiety have been reported at much higher rates, and unfortunately there are at least 2 reports of increased risk for suicide among teenagers and young adults with nonverbal learning disorders. Byron Rourke talked about difficulties with the nonverbal aspects of social communication, including missing subtleties of language, having difficulty because of the visual spatial difficulties, interpreting facial expressions or body language. So if you're talking to somebody and they have this look of boredom, we all know it's time to change topic, but kids with nonverbal learning disabilities might not see that. Lots of difficulties with turn-taking and reciprocity in social communication. Difficulties understanding another person's point of view or understanding humor and sarcasm. So we call these abnormal paralinguistic skills. So they're not the language skills of vocabulary or semantic structure, but they're difficulties with the rate of speech or the rising and falling of speech. So you may, children with nonverbal learning disorders, like kids with Asperger's disorders, often will have flat intonation or unusual prosody in their speech. We've known for a long time that genes play a role in learning disorders and nonverbal learning disorders. There are about 40,000 genes in the average human, and 30% of those, 12,000 genes, are specific to the brain, and you won't find them anywhere else in the body. So the brain is a very complex organ. It also consumes about 20% of your body's oxygen. Turk and Hill in '95 described behavioral phenotyping, the concept that many genetic disorders seem to have a constellation of behaviors or cognitive anomalies that are characteristic of those disorders. So you could really identify behavioral disorders that are associated with genetic disorders. And we all know this, actually. If you think about, for example, children with Down syndrome. We know the cause for Down syndrome, and when I say Down syndrome, everybody has a picture in their head of a child with Down syndrome and what they look like and what their behavior is like, and that they have mental retardation. Williams syndrome, you may not know as well, but these are children who have very specific behavioral characteristics. They're overly friendly, they have marked visual spatial difficulties. Klinefelter syndrome is a sex chromosome disorder. Children with Klinefelter syndrome typically have reading disorders and attention deficit disorder, et cetera. So we know that these genetic disorders have characteristic behavioral profiles. And this isn't a new concept. At the turn of the last century, Thomas wrote about two brothers with reading disabilities and another boy with an affected sister and mother. So the idea that this would run in a family. And what do we look for genetic evidence of reading disorders or any learning disorder? You, of course, look for a family history. You do monozygotic and dizygotic twin studies, fraternal or identical twins. And you look for persistence into adulthood. If you've tried to intervene with these disabilities and they still don't go away, there might be a genetic underpinning to them. We know with reading disorders, again, it's about 10% in the general population. But if you have a first-degree relative, if one of your parents has a reading disorder, then your risk of having a reading disorder is 35 to 40%. It's about 4 times greater. Now, since we've known this information for a long time, for well over 2 decades, you would think that we would start screening high-risk children in preschool and kindergarten. Well, that's still not done on a national level, even though it does make a lot of these reading disorders preventable. So bringing this all back to chromosome 22, we looked at 260 consecutively referred kids, and that's important that they were consecutively referred. We didn't take just the kids who had difficulties or kids who looked particularly good or particularly bad. We just took the kids as they came through the door, with an equal sex ratio and a mean age of about 10 and a half with a wide age range of 5 to 20. 87% of these kids were right-handed, which is consistent with the general population. In the general population, about 85% of the population is right-handed. Most were Caucasian, and as Donna shared with us earlier, it's more difficult to detect the physical characteristics of 22q in African American communities, so we think there's an underrepresentation. So of that group of 260, the mean IQ for the group was 76. So that's in what's called the borderline range. And that number has been found in several other studies with large groups of kids with the deletion. So that seems to be the mean IQ for the group. What was really striking, even in the first 10 kids that I saw, was that 70% of these kids, literally 7 out of the first 10 kids I saw, had much higher verbal IQ scores than nonverbal IQ scores. And I actually went into this project thinking, oh, these are kids with language delays. They're going to have low verbal IQ scores and, better visual spatial skills. And it was the opposite, so it was quite striking. And in fact, that difference was highly statistically significant. So the first thing that I found in my research was that full-scale IQ scores are very misleading in this group because they don't really characterize the subjects very well. Now, when you have a verbal-nonverbal IQ discrepancy, all of us will have it to some degree. 6 to 8 points is pretty typical. We're all a little bit better at one thing than the other. But in our group, 70% had higher verbal IQ scores, and it was a huge range. And typically, almost a standard deviation, a statistically significant difference is 15 points, and our average was 13 points. When performance IQ was higher, which was a smaller group, it was just a few points higher. And this case example, Donna stole from me. So this is really you always pick your best example. And this young man had above average verbal intellectual abilities. He was 10 years old at the time of testing, whereas his visual spatial skills fell actually in the mildly retarded range. So he had a 46-point split. So obviously calling him low average really did him no justice. And so we really needed to plan for his educational planning, we really needed to plan for how best to teach him so he could rely more on his linguistic skills. Looking beyond IQ, I was really surprised to see that rote verbal learning, if you simply take lists of words and repeat them, so just repeat them 5 times to kids and look at their learning curve, it was absolutely normal. It was, in fact, stronger than their verbal IQ score. So these are Z-scores, so the lower you go, the worse it is. So verbal learning skills were absolutely normal. It was stronger than story memory and much stronger than any of the visual spatial learning abilities. And reading skills were quite strong also. So word attack, so phonological decoding, sight word skills, how many words do kids know as soon as they see them, reading comprehension, spelling, were all much stronger than math skills. So I started to see this pattern of a nonverbal learning disability. Performance IQ much lower, rote verbal learning skills very strong, math skills very weak, and reading skills close to normal. One thing I want to point out here, though, is that reading comprehension, I'm already starting to see in this group, is weak. And I think that that's limited by IQ scores. Others at the time were finding high rates of psychiatric disorder, which I won't go into because others will be describing this in much greater detail. So I came away with this idea that children with chromosome 22 deletion syndrome are not accurately represented by their full-scale IQ scores and really display a pattern that's better described, especially as they get older, as having a nonverbal learning disability. They usually have strong rote verbal learning skills, which can be a real key to education. And they're at greatly increased risk for developing various forms of psychopathology. So a genetic etiology for a nonverbal learning disability must map within the 22q microdeletion. And why is that important? Well, from a research point of view, it provides support for a biological basis for a nonverbal learning disability. So it's not just some psychometric or psychological construct we've come up with, but I think there's really a biological basis for it. It helps predict the strengths and weaknesses of the individual children that we see with 22q deletion syndrome, and it provides great insights into the development of normal reading and memory skills. How is it that you can take a group of children whose IQ scores are 1.5 standard deviations below average, and yet their phonological decoding skills are absolutely normal, when in the rest of the world, the most common thing that you see is reading disorders where they haven't cracked the phonology code. So it provides a lot of insight into how reading skills normally develop. I promised some resources for 22q deletion and for nonverbal learning disabilities. The first thing you should all do is run out and buy this book. Donna is here today, and this, what I like about Donna's book is that it is very well organized by age and by kinds of difficulties that kids with 22q tend to have. So it's really a wonderful edition. And one of the most important things about it, I think, is that it's highly validating. If you have a child with a deletion and you go to your school and you present this information and they say, I don't know what you're talking about, you can say, look, how can you not know? There's even books about how to educate kids with 22q deletion syndrome. You guys are not up to speed. So I think it is an incredibly validating resource to have. Sue Thompson's book has been around for a while, The Source for Nonverbal Learning Disorders. And she's an educator also, and she has some great classroom suggestions. Executive functions, higher level organizational skills and thinking skills and working memory skills are a problem in kids with 22q deletion. And this is an excellent book for things to do in the classroom and how to boost children's executive functions. Marshall Duke at Emory has done a lot of work on teaching social skills, so this is an excellent resource. There's now several websites available. Obviously, be careful, the web is unfiltered, but these are some, Byron Rourke's website, I think, is NLD on the web, so he really came up with the term. When we're making educational modifications, Classification that I find very helpful for kids with 22q deletion syndrome is OHI, other health impaired, because of the medical problems that kids with the deletion often face. And the reason I like this is that school districts, that educational diagnoses are often trumped by medical diagnoses. So I find that school districts are much more likely to do what I say when I present it more in the medical context and then help them frame it into an educational context. Of course, children with 22q often have specific disabilities in mathematics, more often in writing, actually, because of the dysgraphia and fine motor problems. LD-NOS, nonverbal learning disability, not otherwise specified because of the fine motor problems. It works, it's kind of a weak diagnosis. If there are attention problems, if it meets criteria for ADHD, you can get what's called a Section 504 plan. I'm always trying to convert Section 504 plans into IEPs because still, even though 504 plans have been around for 15 years, school districts are still kind of fuzzy and teachers don't take them seriously. It's civil rights law, but schools still don't really know what to do with them. So when I can, I convert 504s into IEPs. I won't go through all these classroom modifications. I think they're pretty straightforward. You would use them with any child who has developmental disabilities in a classroom. Consistent routines, elimination of distractions, it's all fairly straightforward. Self-advocacy, especially for children with 22q as they get into high school, and man, if they're going to go off to college, they really need to learn to self-advocate. Feel comfortable asking questions, don't hide, assert yourself. The teachers are there to teach you. So there are things we can do to support them at home, setting up reward systems when they're younger, but we really have to be involved, and the systems that work best are networks where parents and teachers and the student are all involved. There's some helpful adjunctive software such as aerobics for teaching some of the early reading skills. Sound reading is another excellent and inexpensive software that's really brain-based and evidence-based for teaching higher level reading skills. I recently became trained as a CogMed coach. CogMed is working memory training. I actually went off and got trained because I was concerned about the deficits in working memory skills that kids with 22q deletion have. This is software that you do at home, 25 sessions, so 5 weeks, 5 times a week, and it is there's excellent evidence that it actually enhances working memory skills, so children's ability to hold and manipulate information in their head, which then makes you a more efficient reader, and we think also better able to handle mathematical problems. And that's it. I think I've even finished a minute early.